Center for Global Discovery and Conservation Sciences monthly seminar series, and this semester we're doing coastal marine science and management. I'm finding it very exciting to be discovering more and more people on ASU campus who are doing coastal marine science and management related research and education. And I'm also finding it exciting that people are calling in from off campus, from other organizations. So it's exactly what I had hoped would happen by having this seminar series. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shauna Fu, who's really the organizer of this seminar series, and welcome her, and she will introduce our speaker today. Shauna?
Thank you, Greg. So as everyone mentioned, I'm Shauna Fu. I'm a postdoc from the center. So thank you for joining today for our third seminar in this series. So I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Margaux Hein, who is a coral reef ecologist specialized in coral reef restoration. She completed her PhD at James Cook University in Australia and is now the lead consultant for marine ecosystem restoration research and consulting in Monaco. She's currently consulting for groups such as the United Nations Environmental Programme and the International Coral Reef Initiative, and she develops best practice guidelines for coral restoration, recently publishing an amazing guide to support reef managers in planning, implementing, and monitoring new restoration efforts. So we will have time for questions at the end of the seminar, if you could please wait until then. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaux Hein with her talk, Socio-Ecological Perspectives of Coral Restoration, Lessons Learned and the Way Forward.
Thank you so much, Shauna, for the introduction, and most importantly for inviting me to speak with your research group today. I'm very excited to be here. It's fun to share. COVID is making this so much easier now to have those online seminars. I'll start with a quick slide about myself. So my name is Margaux, and I was born and grew up in the Principality of Monaco, which is one of the smallest countries in the world, but also a country that's pretty great in its engagement for the conservation and the protection of oceans, specifically under the leadership of Prince Albert II. But in terms of my career in marine science, it's mostly been in Australia. I've lived in Australia for about 10 years. I did finish my bachelor's in Brisbane at the University of Queensland, and then I moved to Townsville to James Cook University, where I did both my master's and my PhD. I really discovered corals back in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef. I was extremely lucky to work with Professor Betty Willis, and working through her, I got to really dive up and down the Great Barrier Reef, which is kind of like a chance of a lifetime, especially when you're a grad student. But anyway, finished my PhD about 2 years ago and started a little consultancy, which is called MER, which stands for Marine Ecosystem Restoration, Research and Consulting. And I currently work with the UN Environmental Programme, the International Coral Reef Initiative, as well as the Reef Resilience Network. So I've designed today's talk in 3 distinct sections. I'll start by giving you a quick introduction to coral reef restoration. Then I'll give you an overview of my research that focused on coral restoration effectiveness at both social and ecological scales. And then I'll discuss some exciting ways forward for innovations and solutions in the light of the new documents that are coming out and best practice recommendations. So coral reef restoration. I have here the latest definition that came out of the UNEP report, in which it is defined as an active intervention that aims to assist the recovery of structure, function, and key reef species in the face of climate and anthropogenic pressures, to promote reef resilience and the sustainable delivery of ecosystem services. So I know it's a very long definition and quite of a mouthful, but for me, there's 2 important key takeaways from that definition. The first one is that restoration is not seen anymore as a way to restore reefs back towards historic baselines, but instead we're thinking of restoration with climate change in mind, so what the future reefs are going to look like, and focusing on resilience and ecosystem services. And the second key point in that definition is that it's a lot more than just planting corals, but it's focused on assisting the recovery of mostly reef structure and function, again, with resilience and ecosystem services in mind. So we're moving forward in that sense. The most widely used methods around the world is coral gardening, and this is a brand new infographics that just came out of some research team in Australia. The concept of coral gardening was developed by Buki Rinkovic all the way back in 1995, and is based off of principles on land of silviculture. So the idea is that you can collect coral fragments, grow them in nursery, and then plant them back on the reef. But since 1995, there's been a lot of progress, and lots of different methods have been developed at different stages. So for example, the collection of corals, you can collect coral fragments from donor colonies, or you can harvest fragments that have naturally broken off the substrate, which we call fragments of opportunities. Depending on the size of the coral colony or the coral fragment that you get, you can further fragment it down into smaller pieces, which has two main advantages. The first one is that it allows you to have broodstock of corals in your nursery. The second advantage is that we're finding that the smaller pieces you cut the coral into, the faster they grow. In terms of the nurseries, there's two main types of nurseries. You have land-based nurseries and in-water nurseries. Both have their pros and cons. Some advantages of having the corals on land is that you can grow the corals in controlled environments. Some advantages of having the nurseries in water is that those nurseries can be larger and cheaper. The exciting part is the planting phase, obviously. So when the corals are big enough, or when you have enough of them, you can then plant them back on the reef. This is where we have really a lot of different methods at our disposal. You can plant the corals directly back on the reef or onto some sort of artificial structures. And to attach them, you can use anything from concrete to glues, epoxies, plastic cable ties, or coral clips, which is a new technique that was just developed by Dave Suggett's team down in Sydney. But as I was saying earlier, coral restoration is becoming a lot more than just planting corals, and there's actually quite a lot of methods that fall under this umbrella term of reef restoration. So for example, we have methods associated with emergency restoration at the top, including substrate stabilization, stabilizing loose coral colonies, and triage, which is the collection of loose coral fragments. And those type of methods are typically used to respond to acute disturbances such as storm damage or ship groundings. The current interventions that are listed here are interventions that are happening globally at the moment on the reefs. So we have direct transplantation and coral gardening, but we also have substrate addition and manipulation, so artificial reefs and hybrid structures, as well as the collection of spawn from resilient colonies. And in that infographic, we also list some interventions that are in research and development and at different stages of readiness in terms of being ready to be implemented in the field. Those include larval propagation, assisted gene flow, and things like growing corals in laboratory under different conditions to increase the potential for adaptation and resistance. And a key component of that figure is that all of those different types of interventions can be used to move reefs from a degraded state on the left towards a healthy state on the right. But that can only happen if those interventions are used in combination with climate mitigation and the reduction of anthropogenic pressures as well. In terms of what's happening in the field more broadly, so where, what, which species, there was a great review that was led by Dr. Lisa Bostrom-Einerson last year, which focused on 360 studies of coral reef restoration efforts and found that restoration is actually happening all over the world in about 56 countries. 229 coral species have been used for restoration, which is about 25% of all coral species and constitute as well 72 coral genera. In terms of the key results from that review, we found that 70% of projects are focused on coral gardening and direct transplantation. Over half of the project, 59%, are focused only on fast-growing branching coral species. 28%, so over a quarter of the studies, are focused on single coral species. In terms of the reported survival, we are at 66% on average, which is quite a high figure, especially in comparison with restoration practices in other marine environments and even terrestrial environments. But the catch there is that out of those 360 studies, the median monitoring time was only 12 months. And 12 months is an incredibly short, especially given how long-lived and slow-growing corals can be. And I'm also putting this in the context of other studies, such as one that was released by Ware and al. Last year in 2020. And they followed fragments of Acroporus cervicornis in the Florida Keys for 7 years. And there they found that survivorship was only 0 to 10% in the long term. So that's not super encouraging, but we're moving ahead. For me, the key findings from that review and the state of coral restoration at the moment is that there's a huge gap between the theory and the practice of coral reef restoration. So in theory, we're really thinking of using coral restoration to improve reef structure and function, to improve reef resilience, to secure the delivery of ecosystem services. But in the practice, we're very much focused still on planting corals and looking at short-term corals outplants, growth and survival as a measure of restoration success. And so bridging that gap has really been the center of my research in the last few years. So that's a transition to the second part of my talk, in which I will talk about some of my research on coral restoration effectiveness. So at James Cook University, I did a PhD looking at the socio-ecological characteristics of coral restoration effectiveness. So back to that gap between theory and practice, the idea of this research project was to look at the long-term success of coral restoration. I wanted to use indicators of resilience as metrics of coral restoration success, and I also wanted to look at socio-cultural and economic outcomes. So why is the social side of coral reef restoration important? Well, the first thing is that coral restoration is inherently for the people. So if we look back at the overarching goals of restoration and why we want to plant corals back on the reef, it may be because we want the reef to look good for tourism opportunities, or we want to bring the fish back. But what that tells us is that the success of restoration and the ultimate measure of success will be benefits back to the people. The second point is that restoration is undertaken by the people. It's an intensive activity that requires many hands. And we need to understand what motivates the people to get involved and make sure that we have long-term support for the projects to be able to go along for the long term. Third point is that involving people is a great way to improve implementations of coral reef restoration efforts. We can involve them and get some local knowledge of which reefs might be most suitable for restoration. And having their support from the very beginning can also reduce potential conflicts over resource uses. And finally, involving people and looking at social, cultural, and economic outcomes allows to scale up potential benefits. So we're not just looking at success in terms of coral growing and surviving, but we're looking at potential new sources of outcomes and potential for education on corals and coral reefs as well. So one of the first steps of that research project was to come up with new indicators of coral restoration success. And I wanted to have indicators that could connect people and communities, coral restoration, and reef resilience. So we first looked at which indicators would be most appropriate for ecological outcomes. And we had 3 structural indicators, which are benthic cover, structural complexity, and coral diversity. And then we had 3 additional indicators looking at the functional integrity of the reefs. And these are recruitment, coral health, and fish biomass. The idea being that if restoration can improve the condition of those ecological indicators, we might have increased fishing productivities, improved tourism opportunities, and the potential for the creation of alternative livelihoods. And to measure that, we had an additional 4 social, cultural, and economic indicators, which were satisfaction, stewardship, economic benefits, and capacity building. Again, if we can improve, if restoration can improve socio-cultural outcomes, people and communities are likely to further support the coral restoration efforts in the long term. And we find ourselves with this nice positive feedback loop towards an increase in reef resilience eventually. So those 10 indicators were published in a review in 2017 and really formed the basis of my PhD project. I got to test these 10 indicators at 4 well-established coral reef restoration programs around the world. And those 4 projects were selected not just because they're a great holiday destination, which they are, believe me, but most importantly for the seriousness and the extensiveness of the restoration efforts that are happening over there. So I know you guys, some of you guys are map experts, so please don't judge my drone maps here, but they should give you a little bit of a visual of what's going on at each of those 4 sites. So the first coral restoration program I visited is in Koh Tao, Thailand. It's a program called the New Haven Conservation Program, which now became Conservation Divers. They've been in place since 2007. And one of their particularity is that they used many different methods of restoration around the island. So they used direct transplantation, but they also used different type of structures, including reef bowls, steel frames, electrified frames, and glass bottles in concrete. They're also a private organization, meaning that they get their funding mostly from tourists who come to the program and pay to get involved in the restoration efforts and have some education. The second place I went to was the island of Landaa, Girasvaru in the Maldives in the Ba Atoll. And there we have a coral restoration project led by a group called Reefscapers, which is associated with Four Seasons Hotel Resort, which basically takes up all of the island. The restoration efforts were started in 2005. Right after the resort was constructed, the main goal was to repair degradation that had happened on the reef with resort construction, and also make sure that the reefs would look pretty for the tourists who come to the resort. They only used one type of structure, which are steel frames, and they're also run as a private organization, so mostly funded through the tourists and the hotels. And in fact, the tourists who come to the island have the opportunity to get involved firsthand in the restoration efforts, spend a day with the marine biologist, go pick their corals and plant them on the frame. And then every year they get a photo of the frame as a reminder of their work, and a little education package as well. I then went a little further from Australia to the Coral Restoration Foundation program in the Florida Keys. So they've been in place since 2007 and have quite a different approach to restoration than the first 2. Since at the time anyway, they were solely focused on restoring endangered Acropora species on the reefs in the Florida Keys. They don't use any artificial structures, mostly using direct transplantations, and they're a not-for-profit organization, which means that they're getting their funding from government grants and private donations. Last place I went to was the island of St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands, a program that's run by the Nature Conservancy and is very similar to the one in the Florida Keys. So they've been in place since 2009, also solely focused on restoring endangered Acropora species, also only using direct transplantation, so no artificial structures, and also a not-for-profit organization funded through government grants and private donations. Now, it's worth noting that the last 2 projects, so the ones by TNC and CRF, were initially only focusing on Acropora species and only using direct transplantation. But since I did my surveys, they have now tried to develop new methods and also reached out for more coral diversity. But the results I'll be presenting are focused on Acropora species over there. So altogether, I had those 4 restoration programs around the world, but they were established about 10 years prior to me going and surveying them. So long-term, well-established projects using different restoration techniques, being in different socioeconomic settings, And so they really formed a great basis for me to try and assess characteristics of long-term success. In terms of the sampling design, at each of those 4 programs, I surveyed 3 restored reef areas. So the areas where the corals had been planted on, 3 unrestored areas, which were on the same reefs, just a few fin kicks away, and then 3 reference control areas, which were some reef sites around the islands that still look pristine and were the best looking sites in the area, according to local managers. And I also did 30 interviews at each location. So looking at some results now and starting with some photos, because photos are nice, to try and show you what the difference between restored and unrestored area can look like. So this is an example from the site in Crois in the US Virgin Island. You have the restored area on top, on which we have some transplanted fragments of Acroporus ericornis that were planted about 5 years prior to this photo taken. And at the bottom, you have the unrestored area, which is really just a few fin kicks away. And in fact, those 2 pictures were taken on the same day. And as you can see, the difference is still pretty striking. Another example is from the island of Koh Tao with biorocks in Tanot Bay. So the top are those biorocks with corals growing on them. And that photo was taken about 8 years after the biorocks had been installed. And then you have the contrast with the unrestored area at the bottom. So the initial cause of degradation at that site was deforestation on land in this bay, which created a massive amount of sand overflowing onto the reef. And so that's why they put those artificial reef balls there. And as you can see, the unrestored areas had not recovered on their own 8 years after the event. Looking at some data now, starting with coral cover. Coral cover consistently increased at all 4 locations in the restored areas. So on this graph, you have the restored area in green, the unrestored area in blue, and the reference control area in gray. And in fact, coral cover was significantly increased in restored compared to unrestored areas at 3 of the 4 locations. And in St. Croix, even if we didn't have a significant increase in coral cover, we still had a nice trend of increase towards more coral in the restored areas. Similarly, structural complexity also increased at all 4 locations in the restored area compared to the unrestored area. And this time the difference was significant at all 4 locations. The other ecological variables were a little bit more complicated. So looking at generic diversity, it didn't really change at 3 of the 4 sites. So in Koh Tao, Florida Keys, and St. Croix, there was only marginal increase in generic diversity in the restored area compared to the unrestored area. Nothing surprising for the bottom 2, because if you remember, they're only transplanting 2 species of Acropora, so it's not going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. In the Maldives, we had an interesting results of an actual lower generic diversity in the restored compared to the unrestored area. And that was due to the fact that because this project is so geared toward the tourists having a good time and seeing coral grow fast on their structure, they're mostly transplanting fast-growing branching Acropora. But the natural diversity of coral in the Maldives is much higher than that. So we actually have kind of like a trade-off between the tourism experience and then the ecological outcome of the restoration effort at that site, which was unforecasted and surprising. To measure coral recruitment, we're actually looking at the mean number of juveniles on our transects. Unfortunately, we were not able to count enough of those juvenile corals in the Caribbean and Florida sites to get meaningful data. So I only have results for Koh Tao and the Maldives. You can see here that the results varied among the 2 locations. So in Koh Tao, we had a huge increase in the number of juvenile corals in the restored areas. And that was due to outliers on the concrete reef structures. So just like the photo of the reef balls that I showed you, it seemed like corals really like to recruit on those coarse concrete structures compared to other areas. In the Maldives, lesser amount of juveniles in the restored compared to the unrestored areas, which could be due to the fact that corals don't really recruit on those thin still frames type of structures. The other interesting thing to take from that graph on the right is that the natural levels of recruitment in the unrestored area is quite high. And that raises the question of whether restoration is really necessary at that site in the first place or not. Coral health varied among location and restoration design. So on those graphs, you actually have the mean prevalence of unhealthy coral colonies. So the lower the bars, the better. So in Koh Tao, we had less unhealthy colonies in the restored areas, which was driven by a lesser amount of compromised coral colonies. So compromised coral colonies are colonies that have been overgrown by algae or broken down or potentially overgrown by sand. Maybe the fact that the corals there are transplanted on artificial structures away from pressures of the substrata might mitigate those impacts. In Florida Keys and St. Croix, we had higher prevalences of unhealthy coral colonies in the restored compared to unrestored areas. And those were driven by higher prevalences of both diseases and predation. Now, the two species of endangered Acropora species that they're trying to restore are actually very prone to both disease and predation. So those results were not totally unexpected. But it goes to show that there might be a need to increase the genetic diversity and generic diversity of the corals that are used for restoration there. Finally, interesting results again from the Maldives, where there were high levels of unhealthy coral colonies across the free treatments. And that was due to the mass coral bleaching event in 2016-2017 when I visited the site. And it goes to show that there's only so much coral restoration can do when a bleaching event comes through, corals bleach regardless. The final ecological indicator I was looking at was the fish response to restoration. And I didn't find any long-term response of fish to restoration. So I know those NMDS's plot look extremely crowded and complicated, but the only takeaway from there is that the different colors of the different treatments are all really overlapping on the graphs, and that at 4 locations, there's no real patterns there. So that was quite a surprise because we were expecting fish to strongly respond to new corals being planted and added structural complexity. But the lack of response itself is quite interesting. And in a paper we published last year, we actually discuss 3 key components that may have driven this lack of response or future responses to fish to restoration. So the first key component is the importance of the connectivity of the restored sites to healthy fish population. So whether we're talking about connectivity to another healthy reef site or other important fish areas such as mangroves and seagrasses, which act as nurseries and transient spaces, it's very important that these connect to the site selected for restoration. The importance of connectivity also underlines the importance of having restoration sites connected with a network of MPAs, for example. Second key component would be to resolve this unknown mystery of the timing of fish colonization to the restored areas. So in this study, what we had was only a long-term snapshot of the fish population at the restoration sites. But it would be really interesting to know when the fish might colonize and how that may vary across different fish species and families. So it's likely that some fish colonize the restored area very quickly within days and weeks, whereas some might take longer to come to the area depending on processes of natural ecological succession. And finally, the design of restoration itself might have a huge impact on fish. So whether or not there's a big increase in structural complexity, whether or not structures are used with different sizes of holes and crevices, these may also affect the type of fish and the overall fish community assemblages that can colonize the restored area. So wrapping it up on the ecological side of the story, does restoration lead to an improvement in ecological resilience? Well, it's complicated. So coral cover, yeah, it improved in restored areas. Structural complexity, yes, also. Coral diversity, well, not necessarily. Coral recruitment, not necessarily. Coral health, not necessarily. And fish biomass, it's complicated. So in a nutshell, a key takeaway from this first part of the research was that coral restoration can potentially improve ecological resilience, but the restoration design need to be taking into account the potential for long-term resilience. So specifically accounting for an increase in diversity and recruitment and fish, for example. So moving on to the social side of the story. At each of the 4 locations, I also conducted 30 semi-structured interviews, and I had about 20 questions per interviews. The type of people I talked to were stratified across different groups of local stakeholders. So we had people involved firsthand in the project, such as project staff and interns and volunteers. I had people from the tourism industry, as well as members of the local community and fishermen. And beyond just asking them to questions on the social resilience indicators that we had, we also wanted to look at the perceived benefits and limitation of coral restoration efforts. And that was to build that narrative of the importance of the social side of coral restoration. So as part of the interview questions, we asked them what they thought was the 3 best things about the restoration efforts and what they thought were the 3 main greatest problem about the restoration efforts. And I run you through 5 of the most interesting results we had there. So the first one is that when asked about benefits, the majority of respondents mentioned benefits linked to the social outcomes. So for example, we had answers like, oh yeah, the restoration project is great because it makes people learn and feel like they can protect the reef. And quotes like this are what we call golden quotes because they really allow us to draw this direct link between hands-on practical experience linked to the coral restoration efforts, education, and environmental stewardship. The other side of that coin is that when talking about limitations, some people said, oh yeah, well, involving people is great, but you know, the fragments might not be well secured and they might fall off in the future. And that's really showing us that there's a trade-off where involving people is great, but we also need some experienced staff to make sure that we maximize the ecological outcomes. Second takeaway, is that when asked specifically about the ecological outcomes, those surpassed the planting exercise. So in general, respondents did not tell us that the restoration efforts were great because the corals are growing fast. What they're telling us is that it's great because it's bringing back a diversity of marine life, both because it's a new tourism opportunity, or there's some direct economic benefits that they see. So that again strengthens the narrative that we need to move beyond just looking at coral growth and survival when measuring restoration success. Third, local community involvement is important. It's important for many reasons. Of course, linking it back to the first point, it's important so we can generate more education and stewardship. But it's also important because when we have local support for the project, we're likely to have this support for the long term. We can use local knowledge to maximize the efficiency of the design of the restoration efforts and prioritize sites that do not constitute some conflicts over certain reef resources, for example. Good governance is important at multiple scales. By multiple scale, I mean that it's obviously important to have government support and legislative support behind the restoration efforts. But a lot of the responses we got also showed us that good leadership and management of the restoration projects were also critical to the long-term success of the various projects. So people, for example, mentioned that having a good team leader and making sure that people were having fun was really a big benefit of the restoration effort. On the other side of the coin, some people mentioned limitations when there were ego wars within the projects, when people didn't get along. So it's important to take that into account in the social side of the story as well. And finally, securing long-term funding is important for long-term projects, obviously, and securing long-term funding may take different routes depending on the type of project we're looking at. So, for example, for both projects in Crois and the Maldives that have private organizations, securing long-term funding is strongly reliant on the project appreciation and the type of experience that the tourists have. If they're happy with the project, if they have a good experience, they're likely to come back, they're likely to talk about the project to their friends who will further support that project. Looking at the project in the Florida Keys and the Virgin Islands, long-term funding has to do with government grants and being able to show that there are positive ecological outcomes associated with our project. So lots of different interesting facets that came out of that study. But in terms of whether restoration could increase and improve socioeconomic resilience, we also ask the respondents to rate our 4 indicators, so satisfaction, stewardship, economic values, and capacity building on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 was a very low potential to improve resilience and 10 was a very high potential to improve resilience. And as you can see, we had really, really encouraging responses across the board. So at the 4 location, there was a really positive signs that restoration can lead to an improvement in the socioeconomic and cultural aspects of resilience. So some concluding thoughts on the research. The initial aim of that PhD was to look at socio-ecological characteristics of coral restoration effectiveness. We found that no 2 projects were the same. There is a great potential for improved resilience for restoration. Specifically the social side, we had some extremely encouraging results, and social components should be integrated as important indicators of restoration success. Overall, the indicators of resilience we used were great metrics of coral restoration success. And most importantly, if restoration is going to be used to improve long-term resilience, then the efforts need to be designed and planned with resilience in mind from the very beginning. So moving on to the last part of the talk, I'll run you through some key recommendations and discuss some exciting way forward for innovation and solutions. And I wanted to quickly introduce you to some of the latest international guidelines that have come out in just the last year and a half with incredible work from different groups, including the UNEP, ECRI, but also TNC and the Reef Resilience Network, as well as research groups in Australia, such as AIMS, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and James Cook University. And all of these documents are really meant to guide and improve the practice of coral reef restoration. I'll specifically focus on 3 recommendations that are coming out of the latest UNEP report. There's recommendations that have to do with steps to take prior to restoration, recommendations that have to do with the planning and design phase, and recommendations that have to do with monitoring and communication. So starting with the fact that the need for coral reef restoration really needs to be carefully thought through prior to even designing or implementing a project. The 2 key questions are, is it necessary and is it worth it? And for that, I mean that we need to carefully assess the initial causes of damage. Why have the corals died? Can those pressures be mitigated? Are they being mitigated, or is there at least a plan for them to be mitigated? What's the likelihood of additional threats in the near future as well as in the long term? What's the potential for natural recovery? Can corals recruit to the area on their own? If not, what are the barriers for natural recruitment, and can we work on those? And also, what's the socioeconomic context? So are the local communities supporting the project? Or are they some obvious resource conflicts that need to be resolved prior to starting a restoration project? And as you can imagine, going through these questions and doing those kind of assessments can be extremely time consuming. And so there's technologies that we can now use to improve the speed and the accuracy of those assessments. So some examples of those technologies include drones that allow us to quickly survey the reefs from the air and allow to assess some sites for priority for restoration. So one example in which drones are particularly useful is to do some assessments after storms, for example. It might take days, if not weeks, to be able to put divers in the water after a tropical storm. But if we can fly a drone from the shore, then we can quickly assess where most of the damages occur and have those sites be priority sites for restoration. Another example of technologies we can use are satellites and remote sensing to unravel the mystery of connectivity among reefs. So this is an example of a study that was done by Ratsos and al. In 2017 in the Red Sea. And through satellites and remote sensing, they were able to connect local water currents with distinct genetic populations of clownfishes. And so we can imagine that those type of technologies can be used to look at connectivity of coral larvae as well. Recommendations that have to do with the planning and design phase are all super well summarized in the new Manager's Guide to Coral Reef Restoration Planning and Design that was led by Dr. Lise Shaver with the Reef Resilience Network. And that guide presents a 6 steps process to planning and design. And I'm not going to go in much detail, but highlight some key takeaways from that guide, which are that we need consultation with local key stakeholders at each of those steps. We need coral reef restoration to integrate climate smart designs, and we also need them to be integrated within resilience-based management strategies. So all of those key steps can be improved by harnessing the power of maps and remote sensing. You guys are the experts on this, and I hope I'm not butchering your work here, but remote sensing is an incredible tool to be able to acquire data on some environmental variables that are absolutely key to the early success of coral restoration efforts. And those environmental variables include water temperature, particulate organic carbon, photosynthetically active radiation, as well as depth. So through remote sensing, we can acquire the data, and through maps, we can look at those data to help, for example, prioritize site selection. In terms of innovation, we now have the wonderful Allen Coral Atlas at our disposal, and I think I have some of you guys to thank for that as well, which is great for many reasons. For example, being able to, at a glance, get a lot of information on particular reef sites, for example, the different types of geomorphic zones and benthic classes, but also overlay other type of information, such as those from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch data, and be able to see, for example, the risk of bleaching and bleaching predictions. Another great thing about the Atlas is that it's a great visualization tool for communication with stakeholders. The design phase is obviously where there's the biggest open door for innovation and one of the most exciting space in coral reef restoration at the moment. We need research and development to help us scale up the current efforts, but also to come up with more cost-effective ways of doing restoration. One example of those are nature-based solutions with hybrid structures that can have the dual role of improving coastal protection and reducing coastal erosion, as well as providing some stable structures on which to grow corals. So this is an example of the design that's developed by Reefy, which is a new Dutch startup, which is led jointly by both coastal engineers and coral ecologists, and is quite exciting. Climate smart solutions, so incorporating climate change into the design of restoration efforts. So from selecting sites with modeling and remote sensing that are less likely to be impacted by climate change, to the choice of the coral species and fragments that are going to be used. We have lots of research and development happening in Australia with the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. You can see on that photo examples of the work that's being done in the lab to try and grow corals under conditions projected by the end of the century to try and boost the adaptation and resistance potential of the corals to use for restoration. Scaling up solution, mainly by using coral spawning to increase not just the number, but also the genetic diversity of the corals that are used for restoration. So here we have work pioneered by Secor in the Caribbean with their tetrapods, as well as example of the larval pools used in Australia. The idea there is to collect spawn slicks and maximize the potential for the corals to fertilize, and then making sure that the fertilized larvae are swimming down onto degraded reefs and recruiting there. And finally, out-of-the-box solutions, which may come across as completely crazy initially, but may start to make sense as we develop the science behind it. For example, we're developing some water cannons with the idea that you can shoot water in the air in summer months, which will increase cloud brightness and decrease the intensity of light that would hit the reef at large scale in summer months. Or we also have the opportunity to use sprays to create microfilms at the water surface to shade the reefs. So that's a more local, small-scale solutions, but sounds maybe more effective than just putting a tarp on top of a nursery. Monitoring and communication, finally, in terms of monitoring recommendations, they're well summarized in the new monitoring guide that was published by the Coral Restoration Consortium, led by Dr. Lise Gergen. Basically, we need a lot more monitoring. We need monitoring to be specific to goals and objectives. We need monitoring plans to be long-term and not static. And by that, it means that the indicators can change through time, through the life of your restoration project. So it makes sense at the beginning to monitor the growth of the coral fragments, especially through pilot studies and the initial establishment phase. But then in the longer term, you may want to switch to other indicators that are more related to reef scale processes and resilience. And we need monitoring to be standardized so we can compare success and learn across projects. Communication, we also need a lot more of it and across different types of disciplines. So we need to do a better job connecting science to managers and practitioners, for example. We need to communicate about both success and failures and learn from failures. And we need to really harness regional and global collaboration. So the platforms are in place and they're wonderful, such as the Coral Restoration Consortium of the Reef Resilience Network. And I hope this will be used well as we move into the future. In terms of innovations in monitoring, there's quite a lot going on. This is an example of reef scale monitoring photomosaics, which I think is incredibly exciting because what it does is that in just one dive, researchers are able to capture 3D and even 4D images of the reef, for which you can literally extract any type of data that you may want. So it's quite impressive. The downside is that it takes a lot of computational time and money. On the other side of the monitoring spectrum, we have genetic analysis that are becoming increasingly affordable and common and are critical to assess the genetic diversity of the corals that are used for restoration, especially in nurseries. And also this genetic analysis allows us to do more in-depth research on some microscale coral processes, such as the balance of zooxanthellae bacteria within the holobionts that may give us some good insights on processes to use for restoration as well. Finally, innovations in terms of communications, there's no shortages there between social media, conferences, webinars, podcast, you name it. Coral restoration is definitely a buzzword in the world of coral conservation at the moment. I think the key here is not to get lost in the game and not oversell coral restoration for what it's not. So it's not a quick fix. It's not a solution on its own. It's definitely not a solution for climate change. And it will not be successful unless we have climate action happen and happen fast. But at the same time, it's great to give coral a fighting chance while we act on climate. It can show great benefits at local scales, and it's also a great tool to engage the public. So on that, a few concluding thoughts. Restoration is a very, very fast moving field of science at the moment. There's still a big gap between theory and practice, and I hope that we're moving forward in the right direction to reduce that gap and make sure practitioners have the right tool and access to science. Altogether, restoration is a great tool to improve resilience, especially at local scales, but it needs to be done in combination with climate action. And finally, it's a very exciting space for innovation and technologies. And I hope you'll keep doing your good work and that we can all fight the good fight. And thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk, and also a huge thank you to all my collaborators at those various organizations, Dr. Gabriel Grimstitch at the UNEP, Francis Staub at ECRI, Dr. Lise Shaver at Reef Resilience Network, and then Dr. Lisa Bostrom-Einarson and Ian MacLeod at JCU. Thank you.
Thank you. That was super interesting and really, really cool research. So we do have some time for questions. If you could please raise your hand just to help prevent people talking over one another. I might start off with one question. So you've experienced a lot of different restoration sites, and is there a technique, an outplanting technique that you think is the most promising or has the highest coral survival? You know, it ranges from larval seeding up to, I think you mentioned like electrified structures. So is there something that you think is the most promising?
Oof, that's a hard question. In the UNEP report, we actually ranked the current restoration methods in terms of cost effectiveness and scalability. So it mostly has to do with the ones that are most widely applied, like coral gardening. We have more information on how successful it can be. Whereas larval propagation, for example, is only at the very beginning, so it's hard to assess its success in the long term. Electrified reefs, I'm personally not a big fan. It's one of those techniques that's quite sexy and interesting, but right now it's still quite expensive, and we're not sure that it's any different than on another artificial structures. I personally think that using some small artificial structures like steel frame can have lots of benefits, because it can have the dual effect of stabilizing the loose rubble on reefs that have lost that substrate stability, and also provide this structure on which we can plant corals away from the substrate, and then not have, give the corals a fighting chance to grow. Once they're established, they overgrow the structure anyway. But for example, in Kotao, we saw we had better coral health on those structures than in the other locations where the corals are directly planted on the reef.
I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to ask my other question. Oh, JD, did you have a question?
Yeah, just like a couple of questions, if that's okay. I'll ask one first. So Margaux, this was great. So I was wondering, when you were talking about the community engagement, is that engagement directly once in the water, or like I was thinking, since these reefs can be mapped in 3D and there are game engines and all these things, so is there also some involvement at the stage of designing what will go where? From the...
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think the best is to involve them in any way that you can. So if you can involve people in the design, that's absolutely wonderful. What we found is that the involvement in the water, so having this hands-on experience, is somehow transformative for people. They realize that the coral is an animal, they realize how fragile it is, and it really like makes them want to protect them further. But there's also other types of engagement where we've seen, for example, in the Florida Keys with CRF holding some local community events where they invite people to talks and they show them some designs of the coral tree they have for their nurseries, and involving high school students in those kind of events is also extremely powerful.
Got it. And my second part is not a question, it's like a thought for collaborations. I'm a roboticist, we are building these underwater drones now. And one application that I'm challenging my students with is underwater manipulation. So manipulation with manipulators, you can do with ROVs, of course. It's hard even on land. Aerial manipulation from drones is one topic, but especially underwater. So that could play a role in automated restoration, maybe a few years from now.
Yeah, it could. It would be fun to have that for predator control.
Ah, okay. Cool. That's all from me. This is great. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Rachel, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah, I guess back to the community piece, it seems like the economic makeup and also maybe the transience of the population in terms of like the Florida Keys, I think a lot of kind of like short-term renters might be there. Do you see differences that way? And do you think that impacts kind of interactions with the community for these projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's true. I think it's especially true in terms of the ways the projects are being managed. So in terms of how many volunteers and interns are involved in the project, and you're right, a lot of those people are transient. So they're involved for a few months and then they move away, and that might affect the effectiveness of the project a little negatively, because you basically have to spend a lot of time training those people over and over and over again. On the other end of the spectrum, well, the catch, I guess, is that you get to train more people and involve more people. So that's also positive. And transients, you know, if it's tourists that are only there for a little while, they get to bring their newfound passion for coral somewhere else. So that's positive as well.
Maybe there's time for one more question if anyone wanted to speak up.
I have one. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Margaux, that was a great talk. Thank you. And I'm thinking about your climate smart design thinking. I'm thinking about your thinking. When we work at the scale at which we work, which is global, and we see opportunities that might be cross a jurisdictional boundary or an ecological boundary in terms of where outplanting would have higher efficacy, such as more northern sites. What's the international community doing or thinking, or is there a discussion about the fact that coral outplanting may need to happen further north into areas that currently those outplants would be seen as invasive species or introduced species, or kind of the scale issue in that context? Is that a topic that's being thought of in this climate smart design arena?
Not really, actually. I mean, we are thinking of ways in which coral restoration can assist species migration. It's something that's been brought up, but I don't think I've seen much discussion around, you know, moving corals artificially to areas, well, northern areas or southern areas in the southern hemisphere. But it's a really good topic. I think it's more about finding those natural refuges where corals might do well in warm conditions, and really making sure that on the one hand we protect those areas, and on the second hand, those areas might be good sources of corals to use for restoration. In terms of your comment about global politics in terms of well, jurisdictions is always a problem in marine protection. It's been a problem with MPAs, and the fact that ocean resources don't have, you know, boundaries, geopolitical boundaries. And so there's a big push in terms of being able to move corals from one country to the other without having too much legislative red tape around it, especially in the Caribbean region, where it would make sense to be able to grow corals en masse in a land-based nursery, for example, and then export those to different countries without having too many issues. But no, it's good. I'll keep your comment in mind. I think it's very interesting, the idea of what is going to be the debate about bringing corals to where they're not now, but maybe there will be in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again, Margaux. We better wrap it up so people can move on to our next meetings. So thanks everyone for for joining, and please join again next month on the 22nd of April at 12 p.m. for our next seminar, which will be with Olani Wilhelm, the Senior Vice President for Center for Oceans from Conservation International. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaux. Thank you, Shauna.
Thanks, Margaux.